I haven't made a video in so long. Rest assured, I haven't forgotten about any of you. I've actually been rather busy. I'm now back in my rather chillsome, damp and arguably dreary island home of Great Britain. I got back about a week ago. For those of you who don't know, I've been living in the States nomadically, quite literally jumping around from state to state, meeting an extraordinary mix of people and plunging myself into quite an array of environments, so I could fine-tune certain principles and convictions I've always held. Life in America was tremendously exciting, but at times exhausting. Sometimes to the point of mental stagnation and incapacitation. For a while I felt myself spiritually drift back to the UK, but I kind of warded off that natural tendency and resisted for quite some time, but eventually I succumbed to it. And now here I am. So let's get straight into it, shall we? I plan on making videos more frequently. The reason why I haven't made a video in, I think it's 2 months, probably more actually, is because, well, it's not because I've not had anything to say. I've always got plenty to say, but it's more to do with the amount of changes I've been going through. The gradual expansion of certain perceptions that I wouldn't want to interfere with that process. If you are someone who feels as though you have a message to convey, like I do, then it only feels right to convey the message when you are ready and when the message is ready. It's a bit like the digestive system. So you need to absorb the information around you and allow it to process. And then you send it back out into the world when it's fully formed, fully developed. You eat food, you chew it mindfully, you swallow it, and it undergoes quite a tedious process. I'll spare you the rest of the story, as I'm sure you know it very well. So yeah, I suppose right now I feel as though it's time to say stuff. One thing I have been thinking about a lot recently is empathy. Autistic people, classically autistic people, are often accused of being devoid of empathy, when really that's not the case at all. And also I think people either fail to realise or don't know that empathy exists in various forms. I'm only going to talk about 2 today. So when we think about empathy, we think about its conventional definition, that it's the ability to process and feel the emotions of others. And I would define that more specifically as emotional empathy. The heart is like a receptacle. Feelings come flooding in and render us in whichever state that we're mirroring in of the person we're currently focused on. And if you only need to place an autistic person in a multisensory environment, be it a classroom, a bowling alley, a shopping centre, or something of the like, to see that it really overwhelms them, it really distresses them, it really unnerves them. And I think the reason why people think autistic people have a lack of empathy is mainly to do with many of them have an inability to express sympathy, sympathy being the implementation of emotional empathy. And in order to be sympathetic, we need to have a certain amount of cognitive empathy, the ability to understand why most of us don't like it when a dog is being kicked, or a child is being bullied, or a homeless person is sitting in the cold. It makes us feel uncomfortable. We'll observe external phenomena or human behaviour, and we immediately form an opinion or judgment. You know, if we see someone happy, it makes us happy. If we see someone sad, it makes us feel a little bit, gloomy. Most of us have evolved that capacity. So, the human race can look out for each other. So I would argue that classically autistic people have a surplus of emotional empathy and a deficit of cognitive empathy. Is it possible to have a surplus of cognitive empathy but a deficit of emotional empathy? I would make a case that this defines psychopaths. This is a trademark of psychopath. The ability to understand feelings, the ability to manipulate, and the ability to fully assimilate and recognize emotions without actually taking them on. So it's interesting how these two different groups of people experience empathy of forms which are diametrically opposed. So, where does PDA come in? Well, it's interesting because people with PDA seem to have a balance of both. But sometimes one is turned on and the other is not. When we are triggered, we have a sudden upwelling of emotional empathy that kind of bypasses our cognition. So we could have a meltdown and it could manifest as this poetic rant, this poetic tirade of abuse. And then, once everything has been cleared and everything subsides, the cognitive empathy begins to kick in. Whilst this is still calming down, it's like the ratio evens itself out. And then the apologies ensue. The guilt sets in. So, yeah, it seems to be... I've covered triggers before and ways in which we can forestall them. And that's not just down to the person with PDA to ensure that everyone around them is going to cater to their sensitivity. It's up to the person with PDA to pick their environment carefully and be aware of what may trigger them, because anything can be a minefield, as we all know too well. PDA, I'm using the word PDA. I know this has been quite a controversy in the past. Sometimes it's necessary to use the word PDA. It really is. I advocate finding your element and natural habitat, so the label becomes redundant, but in a non-idealistic world, sometimes it is absolutely useful. Okay, so I think I've pretty much covered everything / exhausted that subject. It's good to see you again. Not that I can see you, but it's good to be back here, behind the camera.